Our first presenter is Almut Hupbach from Lehigh University. She has recently been conducting some of the core work on exploring the possibility that this hypothesized sort of stage of reconsolidation actually applies to event memories, and I'm very much looking forward to her discussion here today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's an honor to be here. And I would like to talk about reconsolidation in human memory. And let me start off with giving you a brief overview of what I will be talking about. First, I would like to introduce the concept of reconsolidation. And in order to do so, I briefly have to talk about what is consolidation, and then also talk about what do we mean by reconsolidation. Cover some of the central findings in laboratory animals, because this phenomenon has mostly been studied in animals, not so much in humans. I'll then tell you what we know from the human case in three different paradigms: procedural memory, fear conditioning, and episodic memory. I'll spend the most time on episodic memory because of most relevance to this audience, and I will end with a summary, and we'll touch on some of the practical implications. The concept of reconsolidation. The process of consolidation, or the suggestion that something like consolidation happens, goes back over 100 years ago, and it was first introduced by Müller and Piltzecker. Very much in the tradition of the early 20th century, they studied memory for nonsense syllabus. And what they did is they had people encode a list of some nonsense syllabus, and then they waited various time periods until they presented a second list of nonsense syllabus. And what they found is that the longer they waited, the less did the second list interfere with memory for the first list. And so they concluded that the memory of newly learned material initially persists in a fragile state, but that over time, a stabilization process kicks in that takes out the fragility of the memory trace and makes the memory stable and immune to disruption. So this is the very basic model here. So an event is encoded that initially leads to some sort of fragile memory, which can be interfered with or disrupted. Then a consolidation process over time stabilizes this memory and leads to a long-term stable, fixed memory trace. In the 100 years to follow, initially a lot of research has concentrated on the behavioral correlates of this process, and since about the 1960s, people have studied or revealed the cellular and molecular mechanisms underlying this process. Two very prominent names, one of them is among us today, James McGough, and the Nobel Prize laureate Eric Kandel have revealed some of the key changes on the synaptic and cellular level that subserve this consolidation process. Throughout the years, some labs have asked what happened if such a fixed long-term memory is retrieved. And they have found that once that memory is retrieved, it becomes fragile again or prone to interfering effects. But it was not until the year 2000 that this really became kind of a hot topic in neuroscience. And in the year 2000, two labs demonstrated this retrieval-induced plasticity or fragility, and those are the labs by Nader and Susan Serra. And let me tell you briefly the basic paradigm of a reconsolidation study as done in the animal world. So the animal learns something. Often it's some sort of fear conditioning paradigm. Then the memory is allowed to stabilize or consolidate. So there's a time period inserted here, and then the memory is reactivated. A cue is presented that was present during initial learning, or some other, or the animal returns to the context in which learning took place originally. So the memory is reactivated, and then a treatment is applied, a treatment that is known to affect initial storage, but now it's applied after retrieval or reactivation of this memory. and it's compared to control condition that does not cause any amnesic effects. Then the memory is tested immediately after, and then there is another time period of waiting, and the memory is tested long term. The assumption is that if this amnesic treatment affects the reactivated memory, it should show up after a longer time period, because this treatment should actually affect the restorage or reconsolidation or restabilization of this memory. And this is exactly what has been demonstrated now in a variety of animal paradigms, in a variety of species, and it's illustrated down here. So when you compare the amnesic treatment to a control treatment, shortly after this reactivation phase, there is no difference between animals treated with those two different types of treatment. But you see over time, the long-term restorage of the memory is impaired, and you see that the treatment, the amnesic treatment, leads to depletion of this memory in all of those different paradigms I put up here. Of course, important to note is if you do not reactivate, this treatment has no effect on the memory. So that's one of the very important control conditions. You have to reactivate or retrieve the memory in order to be able to modify it. This has led to a revival, so to speak, of this memory model that differentiates between passive and active states of memory. It was brought forward by Lewis already in 1979, so it's not entirely new. But what it says is that memories can be in a passive state in which they are stable and will not be interfered with by any treatment, or they can be in an active plastic state. And they go from the passive to the active by means of reactivation. And once this memory is active, it is again malleable. And what needs to happen for this memory not to be lost is it has to be restabilized, reconsolidated. So does something similar occur in humans? And we know from a long tradition in cognitive psychology that memory is highly plastic. Already with the work by Bartlett in 1932, we know, for instance, that stories are often not truly recalled, and the true content is not revealed by recall. They are shaped by expectations, by cultural schema, and so forth. We also know, of course, from the work by Elizabeth Loftus that misinforming people about details of an event that later on people will recall those misinformed details as their true episodic recalls. So we know all that. However, the mechanisms and conditions, the exact conditions that trigger such a plasticity or updating effect have not been conclusively determined. And the hope is that by bridging some of the neuroscientific work with animals and cognitive psychology or work in humans, by bridging this gap, maybe we can learn from some of the animal findings and apply them to humans and find out some of those exact conditions that might initiate memory change in humans. However, it's really difficult to study because most of the animal studies use pharmacological agents that are not safe to use in humans. So most of the human studies work with behavioral interference. And what that means is, I have graphically depicted it here, a memory is encoded, then there's a delay inserted, again, to allow this memory to consolidate or stabilize initially. Then the memory is reactivated or not reactivated as a control group. And then some potentially interfering material is presented. And the idea is that this interfering material will only affect the memory if it has been reactivated shortly before. Then there's another delay inserted, and then the memory is later on retrieved. We now have data or results from 3 different paradigms. The first one, who has shown that memory becomes, again, plastic when reactivated or retrieved, is a work by Matt Walker and colleagues in procedural memory. They used a very simple finger tapping sequence and showed that if that sequence is reactivated and the second sequence is learned, the second sequence impairs memory for the first sequence. And what I will talk about today is findings in fear conditioning and episodic memory. Very interesting study was published last year in Nature by Schiller and Phelps and colleagues, which showed that the return of fear in humans can be prevented if extinction training happens during the reconsolidation window. And let me guide you through this study. During the acquisition, color plates are presented, and to some of the color plates, or to one of the color plates, let's say the blue color plate, a shock is conditioned. So participants receive a mild shock to the wrist when they see the blue color plate, but they receive no shock treatment if they see a red color plate. This memory is allowed to stabilize. 24 hours later, participants return to the lab, and they are either reminded of the previous learning or the consequences of seeing a blue color plate, or they are not reminded. And critically, this reminding happens either shortly before or long before extinction training is performed. So what extinction training means is that the conditioned stimulus is presented without the shock, so it's not followed by any consequences, and that usually leads to depletion of the fear. So the fear response is lost during extinction training. And 24 hours later, again, participants return to the lab and receive a re-extinction training, meaning that again, they are presented with the color plates, but without any consequences. And what the typical finding is that here, the fear will partially return. So critically, what Schiller and colleagues have found is when extinction training happens within the reconsolidation window, so the assumption is the presentation of the conditioned stimulus here labelizes the memory, the fear memory, and then extinction training happens within that window, that the fear memory can be permanently erased. And this is exactly what they showed here. They show that during re-extinction training, only the group that received the extinction training on the previous day within the reconsolidation window does the fear not return. Fear here measured with skin conductance responses. However, in the other two groups that either received extinction training outside of the reconsolidation window or were not reminded of the previous fear conditioning at all, they show this return or recovery of the fear memory. What this study shows is that the spontaneous recovery of fear after extinction can be prevented if the extinction training happens within the reconsolidation window or is preceded by the reactivation of this memory. Importantly, this group has also shown that there is no reinstatement of the fear even a year later, so it's a long-term effect. And immediately, of course, what's intriguing about this study is that it has potential implications for treatment of troubling memories that are fear-related, such as traumatic memories and post-traumatic stress disorder. The hope is that reconsolidation could lead to a restorage of a memory as safe without its fearful properties. Okay, now I would like to talk a little bit about my work on episodic memory reconsolidation. In my paradigm, we use a very simple object learning procedure. On the first day, people come to our lab and they are presented with 20 unrelated objects. They have to learn these to a certain criterion. Then we wait 48 hours in our case and bring people back to the lab and reactivate this memory or do intend to not reactivate the memory. We reactivate the memory by bringing people back into the same spatial context where they learned the first set, work with the same experimenter, and they also ask the reminder question. Very simple question, what have you done the day before? In the no reminder condition, which is our control in which we intend to not reactivate the previous memory, we bring people into a different spatial context. They work with a different experimenter, and nothing is mentioned about the previous day whatsoever. All of them then learn a second set of objects. Again, we work with behavioral interference. The assumption is that this learning of the second set will affect this old memory only if it's preceded by a reactivation. We again wait 48 hours and invite people back for a final recall on a third day. And those are our findings of our very first study, the basic behavioral paradigm. What's depicted here is the percentage of items recalled, and the gray bars present items that are recalled, truly recalled from the first set. The purple bars represent items that are falsely recalled from set 2, although the instruction is that people should only recall set 1 items. So those are intrusions or inclusions of the new set into the old memory. What we see here, there is no reminder-induced strengthening or weakening of the original memory. This difference here in the gray bars is not statistically significant, but what is significant is that in the reminder group, people include a lot of set 2 items into their recall of set 1 memory. And we have interpreted this as a sort of updating effect by which in session 2, the old memory is reopened to change and the new items are incorporated into this old memory, something that does not happen in the no reminder group. Importantly, it is to mention that this effect is specific to set 1, so it's not just a plain source memory difficulty. People in the reminder group do not just have difficulty sorting out which item is from set 1 and which item is from set 2. It does not happen that set 2 items would be dragged into set 2 memory. So we have tested that as a control, and it's not happening. In another set of studies, then we wanted to know, well, going back to the exact circumstances that lead to memory updating, what is it that triggers this inclusion effect of set 2 items into set 1 memory? And you may recall that in our initial study, we had 3 different components in our reminder condition. We had the spatial context, a reminder question, and whether or not the same or different experimenter was present in the second session. And in our study, we evaluated all of those 3 different components independently. And this is what we find. Again, please concentrate on the purple bars because those represent the intrusions or inclusions of from the second set into the first one, what we name or call the updating effect. And what we see, it's only when people learn the first and second set in the same spatial context that this effect occurs. The experimenter by itself and the reminder question do not play or trigger any updating. So what this shows is that the spatial context has a special effect or is a special reminder that is critical to updating. And when you think about episodic memories, it's really important where something happened in addition to when something happened. And it might be the case that every time you revisit an old context, those old episodes are reactivated, potentially updated, whereas when you go to a new context, you create an entirely new, different episode. There's one caveat which I want to mention is that in highly familiar contexts, so some contexts in which you are a lot, your home, your house, the spatial context loses this predictive or updating triggering power. In those cases, it's, again, those other reminder components that take over and play this updating role. What are some of the boundary conditions of memory updating? So are all memories equally updatable, or is there some limit on what can be done or changed? And we know from the animal literature, again, that strong fear memories are initially resistant to updating or change. And we wanted to know if the same applies to human memories. So we manipulated the memory strength by overtraining people on the very first set of objects. So we gave them a lot of learning trials until they actually could perfectly recount those objects. And we compared this condition to a condition where people just received little training on this first set of objects. And what's depicted here is the proportion of intrusions among recalled items. So we took all of the items that were recalled and just looked at how many of those items are actually intrusions from the second into the first set. And this, the purple bar here is the reminder conditions, and the gray bars are the no reminder conditions. And we see that overtraining reduces or decreases the proportion of intrusions. So when you have a really strong, stable memory, you are less likely for this memory to be changed or to be updated. Whereas when you have a weak memory, a lot of what you recall actually constitutes intrusions that are from a second set and from another session, and are not recounts of the original memory. So as a quick summary with regard to episodic memory, we see that reactivation can cause memory change. This change does not happen if memories are not reactivated. In most cases, updating is triggered by a spatial context reminder. So learning something in the same space as learning something previously will lead to a change of the original memory. In familiar contexts, the spatial context does not play this role. It's other reminders that take over. Updating appears to be similar in children and adults. I have not talked about this in detail today, but we have data that show that similar processes apply already at age 5 and onward. And we see that memory strength modulates the updating effect. It's not just overtraining, it's also, for instance, when you ask somebody to recall a memory and strengthen it that way, that updating is reduced. So the stronger the memory, the less likely it is that it will be changed. I would like to end my talk with a general summary about memory reconsolidation in humans and touch on some of the practical implications. First thing I want to say is that there's, of course, no direct evidence for reconsolidation in humans. It's all inferred. But what we see is that retrieval or reactivation really induces some sort of lability or plasticity into the trace, that memories can be changed or modified when they are reactivated. So memory reactivation can cause memory change in a variety of memory systems. Interestingly, though, is that we see different effects of presenting interfering material depending on the memory system in question. So in some cases, we see an impairment or replacement. New information replaces old information or impairs recall of old information. And in some other cases, we see more of an integration of new information into old memory. So the question is, why do we see these different effects? One hypothesis is that it really depends upon how widespread the representation of a memory in the brain, so to speak. In case of episodic memories, they depend on distributed cortical representations, and therefore presenting something new might lead to just incorporating this new information into the old memory, versus in fear conditioning or procedural memory, we have more localized representations. And in this case, it might be the case that memories are really inferred with or replaced or impaired. Alternatively, the question of interference versus integration might be a question of how much competition is going on between the old and the new memory or new information. If there's a lot of competition and they really exclude one another, we might see a replacement or impairment. If they can coexist with one another, we might see that they actually just are integrated into the old memory. So why do we have such a flawed memory system, one might ask? And we would argue that it's actually not a design flaw, that it might be intended for an organism that really lives in a constantly changing environment, that it might be adaptive to have a memory that actually can be changed and reflects basically what happened most recently and not what happened some more time ago, which might not be relevant anymore in our environment. And in fact, in animals, it has been shown that the reconsolidation only occurs if there really is a mismatch between what happened before and what happens now, or there is only in the phase of novelty detection. So what are some of the practical implications? Of course, depending on the context, memory updating may be desired or might really not be desired. And of course, in the case of eyewitness testimonies, it's something that you might want to prevent. You want a real recount of what had happened some time ago, and do not want a changed memory report. However, in other contexts, it might be really desired to have a change. So when you think of educational contexts, it might be important to know under which condition you can actually foster the incorporation of new information into old knowledge structures. So what are the conditions that benefit that transfer? And of course, it also has potential implications for therapeutic attempts to help people deal with potentially troubling memories, or at least the emotional parts that are troubling for people in, for instance, post-traumatic stress disorder. No matter what the field, I think it's really important to understand the exact circumstances leading to memory change, or the circumstances that, for that matter, prevent memory change. And I think we have made a good start in the human case, but we have a lot more work to do. And I would like to end with thanking the National Science Foundation for supporting my work, and thanking my collaborators, Rebecca Gomez and Linda Dell at the University of Arizona, and Oliver Hart at McGill University. And thank you all for listening to me.
So we're going to take a few questions after each talk, and then we'll have some time still for summary discussion at the very end with all speakers. So we're open for questions. Yeah. Sorry, and I made one mistake, Beth. I needed to announce. Apparently, this is also being recorded, and so if we could have the questions into microphones, that would be great. Thank you.
I should also note, I should have said this at the beginning, this is being video recorded and audio recorded. If you don't want to have your words posted on the web for all eternity, don't say anything.
So, excellent talk, but as I was listening to you, I was thinking about, in the legal context, the number of times that people, especially children, but even non-children, are interviewed repeatedly. And so it leads to this question about, I mean, just how many times can you keep on updating a given individual memory, and especially be interested in your work with children and the problems inherent in all those repeated interviews.
It's not been studied really how often you can actually, recycle basically through the same process of reactivating and then trying to change it again and reactivating, changing again. It's definitely an empirical question. I would think, though, that there should be actually no limits to going through this process over and over again. One thing, though, that might be a boundary to that is that the elements you can really recall over and over again, so consistently over several recall trials, will probably be the elements that will really stabilize over time, which you will not mess with or change later on. Because every recall trial is also, of course, some sort of a stabilization trial where you really improve memory for what you can recall, but might actually lose more and more of what you cannot recall. So the more peripheral details might be changed over time even more drastically if you repeat this process multiple times.
Other questions? Okay.
What was the spatial context of the probe trial? So when you were asking them to recall, was that done in the familiar room, the unfamiliar room, or so was that done in a third room or in one of the first two?
In the reactivation groups, the context stays stable through all 3 sessions. So what changes is for the no reminder group or the no reactivation group, they learn context A, then go to context B, and then recall also in context A. So there's a change for the no reminder, but there's a stability for the reminder.
Okay,
they learn in context A.
Do we know anything about the timing element, that is, what the critical time is, and whether that varies according to the type of memory or emotional content of that memory?
The timing of
during which
it becomes labile again?
yes, exactly.
Yeah, we know a lot about this in the animal case, but we know not so much about it in the human case, and it might actually be different from paradigm to paradigm. We know, for instance, for the fear conditioning, the window is limited to about 6 hours. So if you go outside of those 6 hours, you'll not touch the reactivated memory anymore. In the episodic paradigm, I'm not sure. I think it's usually the case. You will be safe, I'm assuming it's about 4 to 6 hours of time of lability or fragility that you reintroduce with a reminder. But it's not been tested exclusively. We are not sure. We haven't tested out the time delays under which this interference might play a role.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
You showed that when there are, you do more training, you get less intrusions. And I'm wondering, you showed sort of 2 levels of that. And I'm wondering, do you see a nice continuum on there that you might expect if people were sort of updating their memories probabilistically? Or if you do that intermediate training, do you see there's some point where, you know, once they've done it 5 times, then there's a big jump in their response?
I think we have not manipulated it in those subtle increments. So far what we see is that it seems to be kind of a linear function. The less you train, the more intrusions. If you have mediocre training, the intrusions are also kind of in the medium stage. And if you overtrain a lot, you see a kind of a decrease in those intrusions. They're not completely gone though. They're still different to a no reminder condition. So although this overtraining prevents it somehow or somewhat, it's not entirely taking it away.
Okay, thank you.